Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today I want to take a moment to talk about sporterized rifles and their restoration. In general, I think this is a trap that a lot of people may very well fall into of, oh, I got this rifle and it was super cheap, it's been sporterized and I'll just restore it. Like, I'll put it back together the way it was supposed to be. And that can often be a more difficult and definitely a more expensive prospect than some people expect. But sometimes it's totally feasible, and there is absolutely something beneficial and noble is probably a bit too far to go, but there's something very worthwhile about restoring a sporterized military firearm to its original historical condition. But there are limitations. So just to start off with, sporterizing was something that was typically done when it was cheaper to buy a surplus military firearm than a current production modern gun. And so people who were looking for just sort of a generic, cheap hunting rifle, they'd gravitate towards a military surplus. Like, it's already in a nice, a full power rifle cartridge that'll do just fine. The gun's already built. They're a little heavier than you might want, and they don't look like hunting rifles, so we'll just buy that for half the price of a modern new gun and then make some changes to it, which typically involved cutting down the stock. So let's just take an Arisaka here as an example, something that was done relatively common, sporterizing Arisakas. Well, if it's a hunting rifle, like, you don't need this bit of the stock, so we'll cut that off and we'll just toss it away. And we might take the bolt handle, and instead of having a straight bolt handle, well, it's better, I suppose. It's a little less likely to snag on something, I guess, if we bend the bolt handle down. So we'll take a torch and we'll heat that up and we'll bend the bolt handle over. Maybe we'll do some other stuff. Maybe we'll take off the sling swivel. Like, I don't want a sling swivel rattling around on there, so I'll grind that off. And then occasionally it would also extend to perhaps cutting the barrel down to make it a little bit shorter and handier, or drilling and tapping the top of the receiver to mount a scope on it, that sort of stuff. That all falls under the general umbrella of sporterized. So if you're going to get one of these and you want to restore it, where to start? Well, the first thing to consider, in my mind, is this project worth undertaking in the first place? So you have to consider the general condition of the gun and whether anything has been done to it that is really, truly irrevocable. If someone has cut off the front of the stock, but they've left the barrel intact, you probably have somewhere you can go with this. You can fix the wood or find a new stock. But if they've cut the barrel down and, say, relocated the front sight, or maybe they put a scope on and just left the front sight completely off, once the barrel's cut down, you don't really have anything you can effectively do to that rifle to restore it. In theory, you could put a new barrel on it, but new barrels for surplus, like original replacement barrels for surplus military rifles, are generally pretty darn hard to find. That's not something that typically comes up as a spare part. If the barrel's been cut down, chances are you got nowhere to go with it. And condition also plays a role here. So let's say you got something like this guy. This is a mess. This is a complete wreck. This is never restorable to anything more than a wall hanger. Just full disclosure, I bought this for next to nothing because it has a very unusual receiver mark on it that I was very curious in. So, I mean, man, this thing, it's missing like all the metal parts. The bolt's gone. The trigger guard's gone. It's rusted beyond, well, I guess not totally beyond repair, but it's rusted to the point that if you cleaned it up, the whole thing would be thoroughly pitted. The sling swivel's broken off, the stock's all chewed up, the stock springs are gone, the rear sight's gone. This is beyond any hope of recovery. So, by the way, also, and I get this question from some people sometimes too, if you have something like this, there is really nothing you can do to it that will hurt its value. So if you're looking for a wall hanger, a decorative thing, this is a perfectly suitable condition to use for that. Another issue that is going to be generally irrevocable is if the receiver has been drilled and tapped. You may, in theory, be able to weld up those holes, but it will involve welding them up, grinding them down, repolishing and refinishing the entire receiver. And in doing so, you're going to lose all of the original finish of the receiver, and it's really questionable whether that helps a restoration. To my mind, if the thing's been drilled and tapped, it's gone. it's not worth throwing away. It'll shoot fine, probably, and you can use it as a sporting rifle just fine, but I don't think those are really worth restoration, because if you go to all the work of fixing the drilled and tapped holes, you've lost a lot of the originality of the rifle in the refinishing process. And if you don't fix the drilled and tapped holes, you've got this kind of ugly, obvious, permanent reminder that this gun has been messed with. So some people may have a different opinion on that one. I think if it's drilled and tapped, it's not worth restoring, unless it's perhaps something incredibly rare and valuable. You get a Cuirassier, Berthier that's been drilled and tapped, go for it. However, that brings us to the next issue, which is, all right, the gun can be restored. Now, how do I go about actually doing it? Typically, what you'll find are bent bolt handles, cut down fore ends, and missing front bits of wood, maybe missing sights as well. So let's just take another example here. Let's say we have an Enfield. Someone cuts the stock off. They get rid of the upper and lower handguard. They get rid of the barrel band. Maybe they get rid of the whole front sight assembly because they're going to put a scope on it. You don't have to worry about a bent bolt handle on an Enfield because they're bent to begin with. So some rifles, Enfields in particular, are actually fairly easy to find some of these replacement parts. The nose caps, the handguards, the stocks, the front sight assemblies. You can actually find that stuff. So in general, if you're going to try and do a project like this, start by just Googling the part that you're looking for, like Enfield upper handguard sale. And typically, if there is a retail distributor, someone like Apex Gun Parts, that's going to have the components, the parts that you need, generally a simple Google search will probably bring them up pretty quickly, pretty easily. If it doesn't, well, you may have something different than an Enfield. You may have a tougher problem. Some guns, like Berthier's, were fairly regularly sporterized, but there is no good supply of spare parts, and people threw away things like nose caps and barrel bands, and there just isn't a good source of them. You will basically not find a retail supplier for that sort of thing. So in that sort of situation, I would say actually eBay is a pretty good resource for some of these individual parts. Some of these sort of parts on different types of rifles have been reproduced at various times, so be aware of what you're getting. Some haven't. Arisakas are another one. We looked at this guy already, but Arisakas are another one that are relatively commonly encountered in sporterized condition, and Arisaka parts are on the relatively hard side to find. In general, I should also point out, like, if you're going into this so that you can restore a rifle to have it as a collectible or to have it as a shooter or to use as a reenactor or something like that, that's a good reason to do it. If you're going into this because you bought the rifle cheap and you're figuring that you can restore it and then sell it and make a nice profit, that might be the case. Like, you can't rule it out entirely, but as a general rule, it's not going to be the case because the market's pretty good about understanding this stuff. And if the parts are readily available to restore the rifle, you're probably not going to get the sporterized one all that cheap, and or the complete rifle's not worth all that much. A standard Lee Enfield, for example, you don't have a whole lot of margin to work with to try and buy up restoration parts and repair a sporterized gun. You can do it. You'll probably end up breaking even on the project. There's not really much money to be made in that sort of thing. The cases where there are things like Ross Mark II or Ross Mark III rifles, where they're far more common to find them sporterized than original condition, and the original parts are virtually impossible to find. I, in fact, have a Project Ross Mark II to unsporterize, or I'm sorry, a Mark III, and I've had it for years, and I'm still trying to find the last piece. It's the last bit of the nose cap is all I need. I managed to find a stock, which was remarkable. But finding some of these bits on some rifles can be incredibly difficult. So in that case, maybe there is a little bit of margin to be made, but it's not going to be an easy project because you got to find those parts first. So there is the opportunity for this, but it's probably not as easy and as simple as you may expect it to be. And there is yet another problem that you do have to take into consideration, and that is serial numbering. So let's say we've got ourselves a Mauser, and someone cut off the front end and got rid of the bayonet lug and the cleaning rod and the nose cap and the barrel and all that, and we managed to find all the pieces. Well, on some rifles, some of these parts are serialized. So this is a Kar 98K, the nose cap is serialized. On a lot of rifles, the stock is serialized. On the Berthier, the stock is serialized. On this, it's the nose cap. It varies depending on the make of rifle, but something that you have to consider is to what level are you going to be able to restore a gun? Generally speaking, you're going to have a very difficult time restoring it to original factory condition. You may be able to get it into the right configuration, but you will not have matching serial numbers on all the parts. Arisakas come to mind here, where things like the stocks aren't serial numbered, but every factory had its own acceptance proof. And if you really want to get serious about it, if you're going to restore an Arisaka, you need to make sure that the stock that you get as a replacement stock is from the same arsenal or the same factory that the rifle came from. And some of this gets into really subtle nuances, which, by the way, can be relevant if you're trying to buy one of these intact as a collector's piece. Make sure that you know what to look for to know if a rifle is in original configuration or not. Is it a gun that someone has previously restored with a stock from a different arsenal? Something to be aware of. So even if, and I should say, there are a couple of examples of guns where you kind of can restore them to basically original condition because a lot of the parts weren't serialized. Carcanos, a lot of the parts weren't serialized. If you've got the buttstock and the receiver, like, that's it. You can't tell if the bolt in a Carcano is the actual original bolt that it came with or not. So if you have, let's say you have a Carcano and someone decided just to bend the bolt handle, well, that's generally a fairly easy thing to restore because the bolt handle on most of them isn't serialized. So that hopefully has been a little bit helpful to some people who want to take on a project like this. The general rules, to my mind, are make sure you understand what the status of the gun is that you're starting with and what the status is that you're going to be able to finish with. And make sure that you actually look into what's the cost going to be to make this restoration, and is that worth it to you? If this is a family heirloom of some sort or a particularly valuable rifle, then yeah, it can absolutely be worth spending a significant amount of money to find the parts, and time as well, to find the parts and do it. If you're just looking to flip something and you have a standard run-of-the-mill rifle, as a general rule, you're not going to have any margin. There's not a profit margin to work with. And a lot of these parts are very difficult to find. So don't assume just because you found it Sporterized, it'll be a piece of cake to restore it to its original condition. Anyway, hopefully this has been helpful, enjoyable to some of you guys. Thanks for watching.